The easiest way to lose your heart is to believe money can protect it forever. On a crisp autumn evening in downtown Chicago, the grand ballroom of the Hawthorne Regency shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers as some of the city's most influential business leaders gathered for Whitmore Capital's annual charity gala. Expensive tuxedos, elegant evening gowns, and conversations worth millions of dollars filled every corner of the room, while a live string quartet played softly beneath the glow of golden lights. Every guest seemed eager to catch the attention of Adrian Whitmore, the 41-year-old billionaire whose reputation for building companies was matched only by his reputation for keeping everyone at a careful emotional distance. He moved through the ballroom with calm confidence, offering polite smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Investors admired him. Journalists respected him. Competitors feared him. Yet no one could honestly claim they truly knew him. To Adrian, every conversation felt like another negotiation waiting to happen, and every compliment sounded suspiciously similar to a business proposal. Across the ballroom, Zaria Brooks adjusted the black apron over her neatly pressed waitress uniform before balancing a silver tray filled with sparkling water and glasses. At 27 years old, she had worked enough long shifts to move gracefully through crowded rooms without attracting attention. She greeted every guest with genuine kindness, thanked every coworker who crossed her path, and quietly stepped aside whenever someone else needed space. Most guests never noticed her face long enough to remember it, and she had long ago accepted that invisibility often came with the uniform she wore. What they never saw was the thoughtful woman behind the warm smile, the one who spent late evenings reading books borrowed from the public library and believed that every person deserved dignity regardless of the title printed on a business card. As the evening unfolded, Adrian paused near the center of the ballroom, while several executives eagerly surrounded him, laughing a little too loudly at jokes that were barely amusing. He thanked them courteously before turning toward another conversation. At that exact moment, Zaria rounded the corner carrying her tray after delivering drinks to a nearby table. A guest unexpectedly stepped backward without looking. She instinctively shifted to avoid him. The movement saved one collision but created another. Her shoulder brushed lightly against Adrian's arm. A crystal glass slipped from the tray. It struck the polished marble floor and shattered into glittering fragments, while a splash of sparkling water landed across the sleeve of Adrian's perfectly tailored navy tuxedo jacket. The music continued, but every nearby conversation stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward them almost instantly. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances, expecting raised voices, embarrassment, or a scene that would become tomorrow's favorite piece of gossip. One hotel manager took a nervous step forward. Another employee quietly covered her mouth. Zaria looked directly at Adrian, her expression calm despite the silence surrounding them. "I am truly sorry," she said with quiet sincerity. "That was my mistake." She offered no excuses, blamed no one, and made no desperate attempt to explain what had happened. She simply accepted responsibility with remarkable composure. Adrian stared at the water soaking into the sleeve of his expensive jacket before lifting his eyes to meet hers. For reasons he could not immediately explain, it was not the broken glass or the damaged fabric that captured his attention. It was the complete absence of fear in her eyes. She was respectful but unshaken, humble without surrendering her dignity, and somehow entirely different from everyone else who had spent the evening trying to impress him. Neither of them realized it in that quiet moment beneath the ballroom lights, but the smallest accident of the night had already begun changing two lives forever. The silence stretched across the ballroom for what felt far longer than a few seconds. Every guest seemed to be waiting for Adrian Whitmore to react. Some expected anger. Others anticipated a sharp remark that would remind everyone who owned the evening. The hotel manager had already started walking toward them, rehearsing an apology before saying a single word. One of the event coordinators quietly signaled another waitress to bring fresh linens, convinced that the situation was about to become much worse. Adrian glanced once more at the water soaking into the sleeve of his tailored jacket before looking back at Zaria Brooks. She remained exactly where she stood, neither retreating nor attempting to win sympathy. Her posture was respectful, her shoulders relaxed, and her eyes steady. She had apologized once, sincerely, and believed there was nothing more she could honestly add. That quiet confidence unsettled Adrian more than the accident itself. Throughout his career, he had met countless people who became nervous the moment they recognized his name. They rushed to explain themselves, compliment him, or search desperately for forgiveness before he had even spoken. Zarya had done none of those things. She had accepted responsibility with dignity and waited for whatever came next. Adrian finally broke the silence. "Accidents happen," he said evenly. His calm response surprised nearly everyone standing nearby. The hotel manager stopped in his tracks. Several executives exchanged confused glances. They had expected a completely different outcome. Zarya offered a grateful nod. "Thank you for your understanding," she replied. "I will have someone bring another jacket if the hotel has one available." Adrian looked at her for another moment before answering. "That will not be necessary." Without another word, he accepted a clean napkin from a nearby server and gently dried the remaining drops from his sleeve himself. The tension that had filled the ballroom slowly dissolved as conversations cautiously resumed. The string quartet continued playing as though nothing unusual had happened, but Adrian noticed something he had never paid attention to before. As Zarya returned to serving guests, she treated everyone with exactly the same kindness she had shown him. She smiled warmly at an elderly couple seated near the stage. She patiently helped a young employee, carrying an overloaded tray. She thanked the kitchen staff when they opened a service door for her. There was no performance in her behavior because she seemed completely unaware that anyone was watching. Adrian found himself following her movements across the room instead of listening to the investor describing a potential acquisition. His attention drifted back each time she quietly solved another small problem before anyone else even noticed it existed. She adjusted a chair for a guest using a cane, replaced a forgotten place setting before being asked, and reassured a nervous new employee with nothing more than an encouraging smile. None of those moments would appear in tomorrow's newspaper, yet together they revealed a character far richer than the expensive conversations surrounding him. For the first time in many years, Adrian realized he had become genuinely curious about someone without knowing their profession beyond the uniform they wore. Later that evening, while guests gathered near the stage for the charity presentation, Adrian casually asked one of the banquet supervisors, "How long has she worked here?" The supervisor followed his gaze toward Zarya before answering. "Almost 4 years. She is one of the most dependable people we have ever hired. She never asks for recognition. She simply takes care of people." Adrian nodded quietly, though he did not respond. He looked once more across the ballroom and saw Zarya laughing softly with an elderly guest who seemed lonely despite the crowd surrounding him. Something about that simple moment lingered in his thoughts. It was not admiration. It was not attraction. It was a question he could not answer. How could someone whose work often went unnoticed carry themselves with so much quiet confidence, while so many people surrounded by success seemed desperate to be seen? The charity presentation ended with generous applause as donors pledged millions of dollars to hospitals, youth education programs, and neighborhood community centers across Chicago. Guests slowly returned to their conversations, but Adrian Whitmore discovered that his attention kept wandering away from balance sheets and investment strategies. Instead, his eyes searched almost instinctively for the woman who had accidentally spilled sparkling water on his jacket earlier that evening. He found Zarya Brooks near the far side of the ballroom, quietly clearing empty glasses from a table where several elderly guests were preparing to leave. She listened patiently as one gentleman repeated the same story for the second time, smiling with the same genuine interest she had shown the first time. She adjusted his chair so he could stand more comfortably and wished both him and his wife a safe drive home before collecting the dishes. There was no audience applauding her kindness. No cameras recorded the moment. She behaved that way simply because it reflected who she was. Adrian accepted another conversation with several business partners, but he found himself answering questions almost automatically while his thoughts remained elsewhere. One executive enthusiastically described an international expansion plan, yet Adrian barely heard half the presentation. He noticed Zarya helping another waitress carry an unusually heavy serving tray toward the kitchen instead of pretending not to see the extra work. A few minutes later, she knelt beside a little girl who looked overwhelmed by the crowded ballroom. The child had become separated from her parents for only a brief moment, but tears had already begun filling her eyes. Rather than calling attention to the situation, Zarya calmly crouched to the little girl's level and spoke softly enough that no one nearby could hear the conversation. Within moments, the frightened expression disappeared, replaced by a small smile. Soon afterward, the girl's grateful parents arrived, thanking Zarya repeatedly before leading their daughter away. Adrian watched every second without realizing he had stopped participating in the discussion around him. One of his colleagues finally laughed and asked, "Adrian, are you still with us?" Adrian apologized politely and redirected the conversation, yet the image stayed in his mind. It was not only what Zarya had done, it was how naturally she had done it. She never looked around afterward to see who had noticed. She simply returned to work as though kindness required no recognition. Later in the evening, Adrian stepped away from the ballroom and into the quieter hallway outside the event space to answer a phone call from his chief financial officer. The conversation lasted only a few minutes before he returned through the side entrance. As he walked back inside, he passed the service corridor connecting the ballroom to the kitchen. Through the partially opened door, he caught an unexpected glimpse of Zarya sitting alone during what appeared to be a very short break. She held a worn paperback book in one hand while eating a simple sandwich with the other. Several pages were filled with handwritten notes in the margins, and a small notebook rested beside her, covered with careful handwriting and neatly organized observations. Before Adrian could read the title, another employee entered the hallway, and Zarya quietly closed the book before returning to work without wasting another minute. The brief moment raised even more questions than answers. Most people spent breaks scrolling through their phones or chatting with coworkers. She spent hers reading, studying, and writing. Adrian had built an entire career by recognizing overlooked opportunities before anyone else did. Standing there in the quiet hallway, he experienced an unfamiliar thought. Perhaps the most interesting person he had met all evening was not standing beneath the chandeliers giving speeches. Perhaps she was the woman wearing a black apron who seemed completely content letting everyone else remain the center of attention. Adrian Whitmore left the service hallway carrying a question that refused to leave his mind. He had attended hundreds of charity galas, corporate dinners, and exclusive fundraising events over the years, yet he could not remember the last time a stranger had captured his attention without asking for anything in return. The ballroom was gradually settling into the final hour of the evening as guests gathered around dessert tables and coffee stations, their conversations becoming more relaxed now that the formal presentations had ended. Adrian politely excused himself from another discussion about investment forecasts and wandered toward the quieter side of the room. From there, he noticed Zarya Brooks once again moving gracefully between tables, her black apron neatly tied, her warm smile unchanged despite the long shift that was clearly beginning to show on every member of the hotel staff. She never rushed anyone who lingered over a conversation, never allowed an empty glass to remain unnoticed, and never treated an influential guest differently from a hotel employee. That consistency intrigued Adrian far more than any carefully rehearsed business pitch he had heard that night. As he observed from a respectful distance, an elderly woman accidentally dropped a small velvet pouch while reaching for her handbag. Before anyone else noticed, Zarya quietly stepped forward, picked it up with both hands, and returned it with a gentle smile. The grateful woman opened the pouch to discover a treasured family necklace was still safely inside. She reached into her purse, pulled out several folded bills, and offered them to Zarya with sincere appreciation. Zarya smiled politely, but shook her head. "Thank you very much," she said softly. "Your smile is more than enough." The elderly woman insisted once more, but Zarya declined again with the same calm kindness before wishing the couple a pleasant evening. Adrian watched the exchange carefully. There had been no hesitation in her decision. She had refused the money as naturally as she had returned the necklace. A few moments later, one of the younger servers accidentally stumbled while carrying a tray stacked with dessert plates. Several dishes tilted dangerously before Zarya reacted instantly, setting down her own tray and helping steady the load before anything fell. The nervous employee apologized repeatedly, embarrassed by the mistake. Zarya simply smiled. "Everyone has a first difficult night," she said. "The important part is that nobody got hurt, and we all keep learning." The young server laughed with visible relief before returning to work with renewed confidence. Adrian found himself smiling almost without realizing it. The scene reminded him of something he had not experienced in years. genuine encouragement without expecting recognition. Before leaving, the young employee quietly thanked Zarya once again. She answered with a simple nod and immediately returned to clearing another table, never pausing long enough to accept praise. Later, as guests began collecting their coats, Adrian noticed Zarya carefully placing several untouched dessert trays aside instead of throwing them away. Curious, he asked the banquet manager standing nearby, "What happens to the extra food?" The manager smiled. "Zarya organizes everything that can still be safely donated. She coordinates with a neighborhood shelter after nearly every large event. She started the idea herself almost 3 years ago." Adrian looked across the ballroom once more. She had never mentioned any of those things. She had never tried to impress anyone. She simply saw needs that others overlooked and quietly found ways to meet them. Standing beneath the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers, Adrian slowly began to understand that the woman wearing the black apron possessed something many successful people spent entire lifetimes searching for. She knew exactly who she was, and that quiet certainty made her impossible to intimidate, impossible to buy, and increasingly impossible for him to forget. The gala finally came to an elegant close as the last guests disappeared into the cool Chicago night, their luxury cars pulling away beneath rows of glowing streetlights. Hotel employees immediately shifted into a different rhythm, replacing polished smiles with quiet concentration as they folded table linens, stacked chairs, and carefully packed away decorations that had taken days to prepare. Adrian Whitmore should have been on his way home, but instead he found himself lingering near the ballroom entrance, watching the organized teamwork unfold behind the scenes. It was a world most wealthy guests never bothered to notice once the evening ended. As he thanked the event director for hosting another successful fundraiser, his eyes drifted once again toward Zarya Brooks. She was helping 2 co-workers carry heavy storage bins toward the service elevator, laughing softly at something one of them had said despite the obvious exhaustion on everyone's faces. There was no sign that she considered any task beneath her. Once the equipment had been stored away, she quietly collected the remaining containers of untouched desserts and neatly packaged meals that had been approved for donation. Adrian remembered what the banquet manager had told him earlier and felt his curiosity growing stronger. Instead of leaving immediately, he walked toward the loading entrance where several employees were preparing the food for pickup. Through the open service door, he watched Zarya greet a volunteer from a neighborhood shelter with genuine warmth, carefully reviewing every labeled container to make certain nothing would be wasted. She thanked the volunteer for making the late-night trip, even though it was obvious they were the ones benefiting from her effort. When the van finally drove away, she smiled with quiet satisfaction before returning inside without expecting acknowledgement from anyone. Adrian realized she had probably spent nearly an extra hour working after her shift had technically ended. The following Monday morning, while reviewing reports inside the top-floor conference room at Whitmore Capital, Adrian surprised his executive assistant with an unusual request. "Can you tell me which hotel provided the staff for the gala?" She looked up from her tablet with mild confusion. "The Hawthorne Regency, sir. Would you like to book another event?" Adrian paused before answering. "No. I would simply like to send a thank you to the staff." It was an unusual instruction. Normally those details were handled automatically by the events department. Later that afternoon, a handwritten note and a generous contribution to the Employee Appreciation Fund were delivered to the hotel. Adrian deliberately addressed the message to the entire banquet team rather than to one individual. He did not want anyone to think he was singling out a specific employee. 2 days later, the hotel manager gathered the staff before the dinner shift and shared the unexpected letter. The Appreciation Fund would be divided equally among everyone who had worked the charity gala. Several employees applauded. Others smiled with relief, knowing the extra money would help cover rent, groceries, or family expenses. Zarya accepted her share with sincere gratitude, but unlike some of her co-workers, she quietly folded the envelope and slipped it into her bag without opening it. Later that evening, during her break, she walked across the street to a neighborhood pharmacy. Instead of buying something for herself, she purchased prescription medication before continuing to a small grocery store where she filled a basket with fresh vegetables, fruit, soup, and whole grain bread. As she carried the bags toward a modest apartment building several blocks away, Adrian's driver happened to stop at a nearby traffic light after leaving a business dinner. Adrian glanced through the passenger window and immediately recognized the familiar black apron folded neatly over Zaria's arm. He watched her disappear through the entrance carrying groceries instead of shopping bags from expensive stores. For the second time in less than a week, he found himself questioning assumptions he had once believed were obvious. Perhaps the richest person he had met recently was not the one with the largest bank account, but the one who understood exactly how to give even when life had given her very little. For the rest of the week, Adrian Whitmore could not erase the image of Zaria Brooks carrying grocery bags into the modest apartment building. It was not pity that occupied his thoughts. It was respect. In boardrooms, he had spent decades evaluating people by performance, discipline, and judgment. Everything he had quietly observed suggested that Zaria possessed those qualities without ever asking anyone to notice. The more he reflected on the evening of the gala, the more he realized that she had influenced him without saying more than a handful of sentences. That realization was unfamiliar, and perhaps even a little uncomfortable. The following Friday, Adrian scheduled a lunch meeting at a restaurant only a few blocks from the Hawthorne Regency. The meeting ended earlier than expected, and instead of returning directly to his office, he found himself walking toward the hotel. He told himself he wanted to thank the staff personally for another successful charity event, yet deep inside he knew there was another reason. As he entered the lobby, he noticed Zaria working the afternoon shift in the cafe. The atmosphere was entirely different from the glamorous ballroom where they had first met. Business travelers answered electronic mail, while families shared quiet lunches and tourists rested after exploring the city. Without expensive decorations or formal music, Zaria remained exactly the same person. She greeted every customer with the same calm warmth and patient attention. Adrian chose a quiet table near the window. When Zaria approached with a menu, recognition crossed her face for only a brief moment before her professional smile returned. "Good afternoon," she said pleasantly. "It is nice to see you again. May I bring you something to drink?" Adrian smiled politely. "Coffee would be perfect. Thank you." There was no awkwardness in her voice and no attempt to remind him who he was. To her, he was simply another guest deserving courtesy and respect. When she returned with the coffee, Adrian thanked her before asking, "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Of course." Adrian hesitated for a moment. "The hotel manager mentioned that you organize food donations after many events. That seems like a great deal of extra work." Zaria smiled gently as she placed the coffee on the table. "It really is not extra work if it helps someone eat dinner." Adrian studied her expression. Most people would expect something in return. She shook her head. "Kindness works better when it is not treated like a transaction." Those words lingered between them for a quiet moment. Adrian had negotiated billion-dollar agreements throughout his career, measuring nearly every decision by return on investment. Yet the woman standing before him viewed generosity through an entirely different lens. Before she stepped away to help another table, Adrian said, "I would like to support the shelter you work with. Perhaps there is something I can contribute." Zaria's smile remained warm, but she answered without hesitation. "They are always grateful for support, but if you really want to help, visit them first. Meet the people. Learn what they actually need before writing a check. Sometimes listening is worth more than money." Adrian watched her walk toward another family, carrying nothing more than a notepad and a welcoming smile. For the second time since they had met, someone had quietly challenged the way he viewed the world without criticizing him or asking him to change. As he lifted his coffee cup and looked out at the busy Chicago street, Adrian realized that the most valuable lessons of his life were no longer coming from executives, investors, or consultants. They were coming from a waitress who believed that every meaningful change began by seeing people before seeing problems. Several months passed, and the quiet partnership between Adrian Whitmore and Zaria Brooks gradually became something that neither of them had expected. They never rushed to define it, and they never allowed assumptions to replace honesty. Every Saturday morning they met at the neighborhood community center, where volunteers sorted donated food, prepared school supplies, and organized career workshops for families looking for a fresh start. Adrian arrived wearing simple jeans and a plain jacket instead of tailored suits. The volunteers appreciated his willingness to work beside them, but most of them treated him no differently than anyone else carrying boxes or arranging folding tables. To Adrian, that simple equality became strangely refreshing. He no longer measured the success of every day by financial reports. Instead, he found satisfaction in conversations with veterans searching for new careers, single parents preparing for job interviews, and high school students wondering whether college could really change their future. Much of that change began because Zarya insisted on introducing him to people before introducing him to projects. One afternoon, while they finished arranging chairs after another successful workshop, Adrian looked around the nearly empty room. Children laughed in the hallway while volunteers stacked supplies for the following week. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, covering the polished floor with long golden reflections. Zarya carefully placed the final notebook onto a shelf before turning toward him with the same calm smile he remembered from the night they first met. "You look happier," she said quietly. Adrian laughed softly. "I think you are right." She tilted her head with gentle curiosity. "What changed?" Adrian took a slow breath before answering. "For years I believed leadership meant having the answers. Now I think it begins with asking better questions." Zarya nodded without interrupting. She had learned that Adrian rarely spoke about personal matters unless they truly mattered to him. After a brief silence, he continued, "When we first met, I thought you had impressed me because you stayed calm after the accident." He smiled at the memory. "I was wrong. That was only the beginning." Zarya listened quietly, never looking away. Adrian's voice became softer. "You never tried to change my opinion of you. You simply lived according to your values every single day." Watching that changed something inside me. She lowered her eyes for a moment before replying. "People usually change themselves. Sometimes someone else simply reminds them that they can." Adrian smiled. "That may be true, but I would never have started without you." The words carried no dramatic confession and no expectation. They were simply honest. At that moment, several volunteers walked past them, thanking both of them for another successful event before heading home. Neither Adrian nor Zarya seemed eager to leave. They gathered the final stack of folding chairs together and switched off the lights one room at a time as they walked toward the front entrance. Outside, the cool Chicago evening greeted them with a gentle breeze. Cars passed along the quiet street, while the city skyline reflected the last colors of the setting sun. Adrian looked toward the community center one more time before turning to Zarya. "I used to think success was measured by how many people knew my name," he said thoughtfully. "Now I think it is measured by how many lives become better because someone cared enough to show up." Zarya smiled with quiet warmth. "That is a lesson worth keeping." They continued walking side by side without needing to fill the comfortable silence, both unaware that the greatest story people would one day tell about them would not begin with wealth or status, but with two ordinary people who discovered that respect, humility, and shared purpose could build something far more lasting than either of them had imagined. 5 years later, the neighborhood community center looked very different from the place Adrian Whitmore had first visited out of simple curiosity. The classrooms had expanded, the career resource office welcomed hundreds of visitors each month, and the scholarship program had opened doors for students whose dreams had once seemed impossible to afford. Yet despite the growth, one tradition had never changed. Every Saturday morning, volunteers still gathered around folding tables before the doors opened, sharing coffee, organizing supplies, and greeting every visitor with the same quiet respect that had shaped the center from the very beginning. Adrian arrived carrying a box of donated books, while Zarya Brooks stood near the entrance welcoming families by name. Neither of them sought attention. Most newcomers had no idea that the man arranging chairs was one of the country's most successful business leaders, or that the woman handing out notebooks had inspired many of the programs now changing lives across Chicago. They simply saw two people willing to serve. Later that afternoon, the center hosted its annual scholarship celebration. Students, parents, teachers, and local business owners filled the auditorium, their conversations carrying a hopeful energy that could be felt long before the ceremony began. When Adrian stepped onto the stage to deliver a few opening remarks, the applause lasted only a few moments before the room grew quiet. Years earlier, he would have spoken about innovation, investment, and measurable success. This time, his words came from somewhere much deeper. "People often ask me what the best investment of my life has been," he began with a warm smile. "They expect me to mention a company, a building, or a financial decision. They are always surprised by my answer. The greatest investment I ever made was learning to see people before seeing opportunities." The audience listened carefully as Adrian looked across the room until his eyes gently found Zaria, standing near the back, beside several student volunteers. Many years ago, he continued, someone taught me that kindness is never a weakness, that dignity cannot be measured by a job title, and that real leadership begins with listening before speaking. That lesson changed every part of my life. Zaria lowered her eyes with quiet humility while several volunteers smiled, already knowing exactly whom he was describing. Adrian never mentioned her name because he understood she had never wanted recognition. She had always believed that meaningful work mattered more than public praise. After the ceremony ended, dozens of scholarship recipients gathered with their families for photographs and conversations. One young woman approached Zaria with tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. She explained that years earlier she had received donated school supplies from the community center after her family lost nearly everything during a difficult season. That small act of kindness had encouraged her to keep believing in her future, and now she was preparing to begin medical school. Zaria congratulated her warmly before stepping aside so the young woman could celebrate with her family. Adrian watched the exchange from across the room, realizing that this quiet moment represented everything he had been trying to build. Not wealth passed from one generation to another, but hope passed from one heart to another. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Chicago skyline, Adrian and Zaria locked the front doors together after the last volunteer had gone home. They stood for a moment on the front steps, listening to the peaceful evening settle over the neighborhood that had become such an important part of their lives. Adrian smiled gently before saying, "People think you changed my heart." Zaria looked at him with quiet curiosity. He continued, "The truth is even more beautiful. You reminded me that it had been there all along." She smiled without saying another word, because some truths never needed applause to become unforgettable. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. Power can open doors. Success can build remarkable things. But only compassion has the quiet strength to transform a life forever.